I died. My body was washed. My friends wept, and they laid me in an upper room. The widows wept over my lifeless body. They held up the cloaks I had sewn as if to say, this was her love. But then the Lord turned mourning into joy, and I rose to my feet again. I was just a widow with needle and thread. My stitches were small, my days ordinary. But the master weaver took even my thread and stitched eternity with it. My story should have ended there, but a voice broke the silence. Tabitha, arise. And death itself lost its grip. Welcome to Testament Unspoken, where we bring biblical stories to life through the eyes of those who lived them. Each episode offers a raw, first-person perspective on some of the most powerful figures in Scripture, told with emotion, honesty, and depth. Please subscribe for more stories like this. My name is Tabitha. In Greek, they called me Dorcas. Both names mean gazelle, a strange name for a woman who spends most of her days with a needle and thread in her hands. It's a story about a second chance, about the power of small acts of kindness, and about what it truly means to be a disciple. Scripture says, I was full of good works and acts of charity, but I want to confess to you something you may not expect. I was not famous. I was not powerful. I was not a prophet who thundered words to kings, nor a warrior who fought in battle, nor a queen who sat upon a throne. I lived in Joppa, the city by the sea. Its harbor was known across the nations, the very place where cedar from Lebanon once arrived for Solomon's temple, and where Jonah once fled from the call of God. The air smelled of salt and tar. Fishermen shouted as they hauled their nets. Traders from distant lands filled the streets with voices in many tongues. Joppa was not Jerusalem. It was not the holy city, but it was the place God chose to weave my story. Joppa was not Jerusalem. It was not the place of temple sacrifices or the throne of kings, but God has always worked in unexpected places, in deserts, in prisons, in upper rooms. And so, he worked here, in a harbor city where cedar for Solomon's temple once arrived, and from where Jonah once fled the call of God. And in this noisy, restless port, I lived a quiet life. I did not command armies, nor preach to crowds. I held a needle. I carried thread. And with them, I clothed the widows, fed the hungry, and whispered prayers that in this place of strangers and storms someone would know they were not forgotten by God. In the bustle of ships and merchants, widows and orphans could easily be forgotten. Yet, in the quiet corners of this busy port, I stitched garments, shared bread, and prayed that even here, by the restless waves, the mercy of the Lord would be known. I was a woman with a needle, a widow who knew the weight of sorrow and the ache of empty rooms. My life was quiet, ordinary, and yet, even in the ordinary, God's presence filled the spaces. As my needle passed through fabric, I thought of those who would wear the cloak, widows shivering in winter, orphans forgotten in the streets. I could not preach like Peter or travel like Paul, but I could sew. Every tunic became more than clothing. It became a covering of dignity. Every seam carried my silent prayer. Lord, let this life feel your warmth. And though the garments would one day fray, I believed his love, stitched through every act of kindness, would never unravel. Day after day, my hands stitched garments for those who had none. I clothed the widows because I knew their grief. I covered the orphans because I knew what it meant to be unprotected. I gave food when I could, comfort when I had no food to offer, and prayers when I had nothing else at all. It was not grand, it was not glorious. But I had learned from the stories of our fathers and mothers in the faith that God does not despise the small things. Did he not use a shepherd boy's sling to topple a giant? Did he not use a jar of oil to save a widow from despair? Did he not take loaves and fish from a child and feed thousands? So I believed my thread and my bread, though small, could still be used in his hands. People said I was full of charity, but the truth is, I was full of need. I knew what it was to depend on the Lord daily, to wake each morning and ask, "How will you provide today?" And every time I gave, it was because he had given to me first. I did not seek to make a name for myself. My stitches were prayers, my garments were offerings, my life a quiet testimony. And somehow, in ways I still cannot understand, God wrote my simple life into His great story. Not because I was great, but because He is. I was a widow. My home once echoed with laughter, but now the walls only held silence. I knew what it was to lose a companion, to wake in the night and reach for someone who was no longer there. I knew the coldness of loneliness, the weight of unanswered questions, and the ache of watching days pass with no one to notice. Loss taught me compassion. Loneliness made me see the forgotten. Struggle gave me eyes for those who struggled too, so I cared for others not because I was strong, but because I understood weakness. I could not stand in synagogues and preach like Peter. I could not sail across seas and plant churches like Paul. But I could take what I had, a needle, a thread, a loaf of bread, and use them as offerings of love. I made garments for widows because I knew the shame of poverty and the chill of winter without warmth. I gave food to the hungry because I knew what it meant to wonder if tomorrow would hold enough. And I sat with the forgotten, listening to their stories, reminding them that they were still seen, still loved, still human in a world that looked away. Some thought it small, just stitches, just bread, just presents. But I remembered the words of the Master. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Matthew 25:40. So with every garment I sewed, I whispered, this is for you, Lord. With every cloak I gave, I prayed, clothe them with your mercy as you have clothed me with grace. With every tear I wiped, I thought of his hands, how he once touched lepers and lifted the broken. And though I was a widow, though the world would call me small, my heart knew this. When given to God, nothing is wasted. Even a stitch of thread can be woven into eternity. My body began to grow weak. At first, I thought it was a passing sickness, a weariness that would fade with rest. But day by day, strength slipped from me like sand through fingers. My hands, once so steady with needle and thread, trembled. My breath, once full of laughter and prayer, came shallow and ragged. And then, one morning, I could no longer rise. The women I had clothed gathered around me. They pressed cool claws to my forehead. They whispered prayers. They wept, as if their tears could hold me here. But my eyes dimmed and darkness came. They washed my body with gentle hands, as if each touch said, we remember. They laid me in an upper room, quiet and still, and their cries filled the space. The widows stood together, holding up the tunics and cloaks I had made, garments stitched with prayers they never heard me whisper. They lifted them like testimonies, as if saying, see what she did, see how she loved. And in that room, I realized this. My life was not measured by the length of my days, but by the love left behind. For they did not mourn my absence because of what I owned or the words I spoke in public places. They mourned because, in some small way, I had carried them when they were forgotten. Their grief was loud, but underneath it was love. And though I was silent, their tears spoke for me. She mattered. Her life mattered. Death was silence. It was like sinking into still waters where sound and light faded into nothing. I thought my story was finished, my thread cut short. The widows and disciples of Joppa refused to give up. They heard that the Apostle Peter was in the nearby town of Lydda, and they sent 2 men to beg him to come at once. Then came Peter. He sent them all out, knelt and prayed, and then he turned to me. Tabitha, arise. Acts 9:40. Life returned. My eyes opened, my hands, once still, were strong again. In that moment, breath rushed into my lungs like a river returning to a dry stream bed. My chest rose, my eyes flew open, and light poured in. My body, heavy and lifeless, now surged with strength again. The first face I saw was Peter, kneeling, his eyes filled, not with his own power, but with the awe of one who had seen the Lord's hand move. He took my hand and lifted me up. The warmth of life pulsed through my veins, and I stood once more. It was like waking from a dream, but this dream was life itself. Then came the cries. The widows, The very ones who had wept over me now screamed with joy. Tears still streamed down their faces, but they were different now, not of loss, but of wonder. They crowded around me, pressing the very garments I had once sewn against their cheeks, as if to believe I was real. The widows burst into joy. They rushed to me, holding up the same garments they had shown Peter in their sorrow. But now those garments were no longer symbols of death. They were threads of testimony, proof that Jesus is Lord of life. And I understood. The same God who wove galaxies had rewoven my life. The upper room that had been heavy with grief was suddenly alive with laughter, with shouts, with the sound of worship. The echo of death was drowned out by the song of life. I want to confess, I did not rise because I was worthy. I did not rise because my works had earned me favor. I rose because Jesus is Lord over life and death. The same voice that called Lazarus from the tomb, the same power that lifted Jairus' daughter called me, a widow with needle and thread, back to life. And when word spread through all Joppa, it was not my name that mattered, it was his. Many believed in the Lord that day, not because Tabitha was great, but because Christ is alive and his mercy endures forever. I want to leave you with this. My life was not filled with grand speeches or mighty conquests. I was not a prophet, nor a ruler, nor a teacher of law. I was simply a woman with thread in her hands and compassion in her heart. And yet, the Lord took what was small and made it a testimony. The cloaks I sewed are gone now, torn by time, worn by use, forgotten by history. But the love behind each stitch was seen by God, and he wove it into his eternal story. You see, greatness in his kingdom is not measured by the size of your platform, but by the size of your love. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in my name will by no means lose their reward. Matthew 10:42. My death reminded the widows that life is fragile. My resurrection reminded the city that Jesus holds the keys of death and life. And my story remains to remind you that nothing given to him is wasted. Not a stitch, not a prayer, not a loaf of bread shared in secret. I was a widow, I was ordinary, but he is extraordinary, and in his hands, even the smallest life can shake a city and bring many to faith. I was not a prophet thundering words to kings. I was not a queen seated on a throne. I was not a warrior who led armies into battle. I was a widow. I had no crown, no power, no name that echoed beyond the walls of Joppa. All I carried was a needle, a spool of thread, and a heart that ached for the forgotten. And yet, somehow the Lord took even that. He took stitches and seams, cloaks and tunics, and wove them into his story. Do you see? My name did not enter the pages of Scripture because I was great. My name lives there because he is great, because the God who shaped stars also shaped my small life into something eternal. My name endures in Scripture, not because my stitches were perfect, but because his mercy was. The cloaks I made are gone. The thread has long unraveled, but love never frays in his kingdom. Every stitch, every seam, every act of kindness is gathered into eternity. So hear me. Do not despise the needle in your hand or the thread that seems too small. For in his hands, even the simplest life can be woven into his eternal tapestry. This is my confession. I was a widow with needle and thread, but he is the master weaver, and he made my life part of his design. It was never about me. It was always about him, the one who said the last shall be first, the least shall be greatest, and that a cup of cold water given in his name would never be forgotten. So remember this, God does not require thrones or crowns to make history. He can take a widow's needle and write eternity with it. So this is my confession. My name is Tabitha. I lived, I died, I lived again. Not because of who I was, but because of who he is. And if he could use me, he can use you. What is the gift that you've been given? Maybe you can't raise the dead, but you can feed the hungry. Maybe you can't heal the sick, but you can sit with the lonely. Whatever your needle and thread may be, use it. Use it with love. Because a simple act of kindness given in God's name can do more than you could ever imagine. It can become light in the darkness. it can bring hope to the hopeless. If you've found meaning in these stories, don't forget to share them with others and subscribe to the channel. Your support is highly appreciated. Thank you. Hit the notification button